Idi Amin Dada.
Idi Amin Dada was a Ugandan military officer and politician who ruled Uganda as president from 1971 to 1979. His regime is widely remembered as one of the most brutal in African history, marked by widespread human rights abuses, political repression, and economic mismanagement. Here are some key points about his life and reign. Early life and military career. Birth and early years. Amin was born around 1925 in Kiboko, Uganda, though his exact birth date is uncertain. He belonged to the Kakwa ethnic group, a small community in northwestern Uganda. Military beginnings. Amin joined the British colonial army in 1946. He quickly rose through the ranks, earning a reputation for physical strength and ruthlessness. He served in several campaigns, including the British suppression of the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya during the 1950s. Rise to power. Independence and military leadership. After Uganda gained independence from Britain in 1962, Amin remained in the army and became one of its top commanders. In the late 1960s, he developed a close relationship with President Milton Obote, Uganda's first post-independence leader. Coup. On January 25, 1971, while Obote was attending a conference in Singapore, Amin seized power in a military coup. Initially, Amin was welcomed by many Ugandans who were dissatisfied with Obote's government.
Brutal regime, de 1971 a 1979.
Authoritarian rule. After coming to power, Amin established a dictatorship. He declared himself president and dissolved parliament, ruling by decree. He gave himself various titles, including Conqueror of the British Empire, and claimed to have psychic abilities. Expulsion of Asians. One of Amin's most controversial actions was the expulsion of Uganda's Asian minority in 1972. Around 60,000 Asians, many of whom were involved in commerce, were forced to leave the country, devastating Uganda's economy. Their property and businesses were seized by the state and redistributed. Human rights abuses. Amin's regime was notorious for widespread human rights violations, including the arbitrary arrest, torture, and killing of political opponents, ethnic groups, and suspected dissenters. The exact number of deaths under his rule is debated, but estimates range from 100,000 to 500,000. Foreign relations. Amin aligned himself with various countries during his rule, including Libya, the Soviet Union, and later, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO. He also had a bizarre relationship with the West, at times courting Western leaders and at other times, expressing hostility toward them. Decline and overthrow. War with Tanzania. Amin's downfall began with his decision to invade Tanzania in 1978, ostensibly to annex part of its territory. The Tanzanian military, along with Ugandan exiles, launched a counteroffensive. In April 1979, they captured the Ugandan capital, Kampala, forcing Amin to flee the country. Exile. After his overthrow, Amin fled first to Libya, then to Saudi Arabia, where he lived in exile until his death in 2003. Saudi Arabia provided him with a quiet life, where he remained largely out of the public eye. Legacy. Brutality and impact on Uganda. Idi Amin's regime is remembered as one of the darkest periods in Uganda's history. His reign of terror left a lasting scar on the country, with tens of thousands of people killed, the economy in shambles, and deep ethnic and political divisions. Popular culture. Amin's life has been portrayed in various books, documentaries, and films, most notably in the 2006 movie The Last King of Scotland, where actor Forrest Whitaker's portrayal of Amin won him an Academy Award. Though he claimed to be a champion of African liberation and an enemy of colonialism, Amin's dictatorship is more often seen as an example of the dangers of unchecked power. Some of his popular speeches. Idi Amin was known for his fiery and often bizarre speeches, which were a mix of authoritarian rhetoric, propaganda, and personal boasts. His speeches ranged from declarations of African pride and anti-colonialism to outrageous statements that bewildered both his listeners and the international community. Here are some key themes and notable moments from his speeches. 1. Anti-colonialism and African nationalism. Idi Amin frequently portrayed himself as a defender of Africa against Western imperialism. He often gave speeches highlighting his belief in African unity and independence from former colonial powers. Speech on African Liberation, 1975. Amin gave this speech during the Organization of African Unity, OAU, summit in Kampala. In it, he emphasized the need for Africa to resist neo-colonial influence and take control of its own destiny. He framed his regime as a model for standing up to the West, particularly the United Kingdom. He declared, "Africa will never be free until we have total economic liberation. Our wealth should be for the benefit of our own people, not foreigners." 2. Expulsion of Asians, 1972. One of Amin's most infamous decisions was the expulsion of Uganda's Asian minority in 1972. His speeches justifying this move were laced with nationalism and a belief that Asians were undermining Uganda's economy. He referred to them as economic saboteurs. Speech announcing the expulsion of Asians, August 1972. In a radio broadcast, Amin shocked the world by announcing that Ugandans of Asian origin had to leave the country within 90 days. "We will no longer tolerate the exploitation of the Ugandan economy by the Asian community. They came here to help us in business, but they have taken over and treat us as slaves in our own country. They must leave, and we shall give Uganda back to Ugandans." 3. Self-declared titles and personality cult. Amin often used speeches to boost his image, giving himself grandiose titles and making exaggerated claims about his abilities. He claimed to be a military genius and a leader of great vision. Declaration of his titles, 1977. In one of his more peculiar speeches, Amin awarded himself a long list of titles that reflected both his military background and his perceived leadership status. He famously declared himself, "His Excellency President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular." 4. Speech to the United Nations General Assembly, 1975. Amin made a notable appearance at the United Nations in 1975, where he took the opportunity to address the international community. His speech reflected his anti-Western stance and his support for the Palestinian cause, alongside his usual boastful rhetoric. UN General Assembly speech, October 1975. In this speech, Amin portrayed himself as a champion of global liberation movements, calling for the eradication of Zionism and imperialism. He argued, "The imperialists have lost the war. The world belongs to the peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The time has come for the West to accept this fact and stop exploiting the developing world." 5. Threats against Western leaders. Amin often used speeches to threaten Western leaders, especially those of Britain and Israel. He had a particular animosity toward British Prime Minister Edward Heath and Queen Elizabeth II after Uganda was criticized for human rights abuses under his rule. Threat against Queen Elizabeth, 1976. Amin's bizarre and often mocking relationship with Britain culminated in a public offer to marry Queen Elizabeth II. In a radio broadcast, Amin sarcastically suggested that he was willing to become the King of England by marrying the Queen. He said, "I want to send a letter to Her Majesty the Queen to let her know that if she needs a husband, I am available." Speech after Entebbe raid, 1976. After Israeli commandos successfully rescued hostages from a hijacked airplane in Entebbe, Uganda, Amin gave a furious speech denouncing Israel and threatening to retaliate. "We shall teach Israel a lesson they will never forget. The entire world has witnessed their aggression and violation of our sovereignty, and they shall pay for it." 6. War with Tanzania, 1978. As tensions with neighboring Tanzania escalated, Amin made several speeches urging Ugandans to support his military campaign. He framed the war as a patriotic duty and a fight to reclaim Ugandan territory. Speech declaring war on Tanzania, 1978. Amin sought to justify his invasion of Tanzania by claiming that Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere was harboring Ugandan rebels and undermining Uganda's sovereignty. "Tanzania has become a base for terrorists and traitors who want to destroy Uganda. We will defend our country and defeat all enemies. Uganda is strong, and we will liberate our territory from Tanzanian occupation." Idi Amin's speeches were a mix of authoritarian posturing, nationalism, and eccentricity. They were often characterized by bombast, inflammatory rhetoric, and bizarre pronouncements that reinforced his unpredictable and dangerous personality. His speeches not only shaped his regime's policies, but also reflected the deep-seated insecurities and illusions of grandeur that drove his brutal rule. His extremely violent act to his enemies. Idi Amin's rule in Uganda, 1971 to 1979, was marked by extreme violence, with numerous acts of brutality carried out against perceived enemies, both real and imagined. His regime is often described as one of the most murderous in African history. Below are some examples of his violent acts and why he earned the nickname Villager Dictator. Extreme violence against his enemies. 1. Mass killings of political opponents. Amin targeted political rivals, intellectuals, soldiers loyal to former President Milton Obote, and even members of his own government. His regime is believed to have killed between 100,000 and 500,000 people, though the exact number is disputed due to the secretive nature of many of the executions. Amin's notorious security services, particularly the State Research Bureau, SRB, and the Public Safety Unit, PSU, were responsible for arbitrary arrests, torture, and executions. Victims were often tortured in Kampala's notorious Makindye military prison or summarily executed and dumped in the Nile River or mass graves. 2. Ethnic and religious violence. Amin targeted several ethnic and religious groups in Uganda. He ordered the killings of members of the Akoli and Lengo ethnic groups, many of whom were prominent in the Ugandan army under Obote. Thousands were murdered in cold blood as Amin sought to solidify his control over the military. His regime also persecuted Christians and other religious minorities, targeting people who posed even the slightest threat to his rule. 3. Execution of army officers and cabinet members. Amin often turned against his own government officials and military officers, killing them when he perceived them as threats to his power. In 1977, he executed his foreign minister, Michael Ondoga, and several high-ranking army officers, accusing them of plotting against him. One of his most infamous acts was the execution of Janani Lowam, the Anglican Archbishop of Uganda, who had openly criticized Amin's regime. Lowam was arrested in 1977, and though the government claimed he died in a car accident, it was widely known that he was murdered. 4. Brutal crackdown on real and imagined dissent. Amin's rule was marked by widespread paranoia. He believed there were constant plots to overthrow him, leading him to crack down violently on any potential opposition, including members of the Ugandan Asian community, intellectuals, and even former allies. His methods of execution were especially cruel. He would have people beaten to death, buried alive, or fed to crocodiles in the Nile. Some reports claimed that he kept the heads of his enemies in refrigerators to display to visitors. 5. Entebbe hostage crisis. During the 1976 Entebbe raid, Amin supported Palestinian and German terrorists who hijacked an Air France plane and held hostages at Entebbe airport. While his role in the incident is debated, he was seen as an ally to the hijackers, and after Israeli commandos freed the hostages, Amin retaliated by killing hundreds of Ugandans, especially those suspected of being supportive of Israel. Why he is called the Villager Dictator. Idi Amin earned the nickname Villager Dictator due to several factors. 1. Lack of formal education and sophistication. Amin had very little formal education. He joined the British colonial army as a simple cook and rose through the ranks primarily because of his physical strength and willingness to carry out brutal orders. His rough, unsophisticated background, coupled with his erratic and often bizarre behavior, led many to refer to him as a villager who had stumbled into power. His speeches and behavior often reflected a lack of diplomatic sophistication, further cementing the image of a villager who lacked the refinement typically associated with heads of state. 2. Rural upbringing and tribalism. Amin came from a rural, underdeveloped part of Uganda and often ruled with a mindset shaped by tribalism and village-level politics. He was born in the Kakwa ethnic group, a small and relatively obscure group in northwestern Uganda. Amin's strong favoritism toward his own ethnic group and his persecution of other groups, such as the Akoli and Lengo, were seen as the actions of a leader entrenched in tribal divisions. His style of leadership was viewed as erratic and based on personal loyalty rather than national governance, reminiscent of traditional village rule where loyalty to the leader was paramount. 3. Paranoia and brutality reflective of village tyranny. Amin's paranoia, with its frequent purges and killings, mirrored the behavior of a small village tyrant who viewed any challenge to his authority as a direct threat to his survival. He often used violence to silence opposition, much like a tribal warlord would in a village setting. His use of violence was indiscriminate, much like a feared village dictator who used brutal force to ensure obedience. He didn't shy away from public executions, mutilations, or other acts of terror that served to intimidate the population. 4. Bizarre and eccentric behavior. Amin was known for his eccentric and erratic behavior, which many attributed to his unsophisticated background. He gave himself grandiose titles, such as Conqueror of the British Empire and Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, which made him appear more like a boastful village elder than a modern statesman. His unpredictable actions, such as challenging British leaders to boxing matches or writing bizarre letters to world leaders, further reinforced the idea that he was more of a villager than a serious political leader. In summary, Idi Amin's reign was marked by extreme brutality toward his enemies, from mass killings to cruel executions. He earned the title Villager Dictator because of his unsophisticated and brutal leadership style, deeply rooted in his rural, tribal background, which he brought to the highest office of Uganda in a destructive and chaotic way.